Peter Kürten, known as the Vampire of Düsseldorf, was a German serial killer. The brutality of his murders and the hysteria that it triggered in the Rhineland made the search for him the most widely noticed criminal case in the Weimar Republic and also sparked international interest. The nickname that the press gave him at that time was due to an incident in December 1929 when Kürten in the Düsseldorf Hofgarten killed a young swan and drank its blood. The fact that he also drank or tried to drink the blood of his victims has occurred in some cases, as the police and court records show. Kürten was born in Mülheim am Rhein, then a booming industrial city near Cologne. Here, Kürten grew up as the third oldest of 13 siblings in modest living conditions. The father, a sand farmer, was an alcoholic who hid his wife and children. At the age of 5, Kürten, accompanied by a dog catcher, discovered his pleasure in killing while drowning 2 puppies in a stream. In his youth, he injured numerous animals with knife wounds. When the father had attacked his mother again, Peter ran away at the age of 8. He survived on the streets with minor thefts for 3 weeks before the police found him and brought him back to his parents. The mother was able to prevent subsequent admission to a welfare facility. Later, he also attributed some past deaths of children and young people on the banks of the Rhine in Mülheim, although it remained unclear whether Kürten, who was 9 at the time in question, was actually the perpetrator. In 1894, the family moved to Düsseldorf. Peter attended elementary school in Gerresheim until 1897 and then began an apprenticeship in sand shaping in the Düsseldorf factory, where his father was also employed. Corporal punishment of the apprentices was still the order of the day there. The father was sentenced to 1 year and 3 months in prison that same year for molesting the eldest daughter. Also, in the same year, Peter choked a girl in the Grafenberg forest. A little later, he embezzled 100 marks in wages, went to Koblenz, and from there he took a trip on the Rhine with a prostitute. Back in Düsseldorf on June 6, 1899, he was sentenced to 2-month imprisonment for embezzlement, which he served until August 1899. Because of spending the night outdoors, he had to serve another 2-day sentences. After his release from prison, he stayed in Düsseldorf without a permanent job. He was now 16 years old and got to know the much older Mrs. M, with whom and her 60-year-old daughter he moved into an apartment. In the autumn of 1904, Kürten developed a great passion for arson, using fuses and matchboxes to light haystacks and barns, and then watching the fire brigade's efforts to extinguish the fire. At the time of the fires, no suspicion fell on him. When he was arrested, around 24 arson attacks were found, although the number of unreported cases is probably much higher. At time in a rented room in Düsseldorf and lived from burglaries. In 1913, he committed the first murder that can be clearly assigned to him. His victim was 9-year-old Christine Klein, whom he found later in the evening asleep while breaking into the apartment of an innkeeper in Mülheim. He cut her throat and was able to escape unnoticed without having found any valuables. The victim's mother, who was still working in the inn on the first floor, noticed the crime a few minutes later when she was about to go to bed. The day after the crime, Kürten returned near the crime scene, where he spent hours listening to the angry guests talking about what had happened in an inn. No fingerprints were found at the crime scene, but Kürten had left behind a blood-stained handkerchief marked with his initials. Since the house owner and father of the girl, Peter Klein, had the same initials, he was initially suspected. He fell in Russia in 1915 without his innocence having been proven by then. Peter Kürten, however, was never suspected of the crime. In the period between February and November 1929, Kürten committed 8 murders. Between February 1929 and his arrest in May 1930, he committed more than 20 assaults, most of them with murderous intent. On February 9, 1929, at around 9 p.m., he attacked Apollonia Kühn in Düsseldorf's Berthastraße and stabbed her several times with scissors. Believing that he had killed the woman, he hid nearby. After the seriously injured woman was able to get her to her nearby apartment, he briefly returned to the deserted crime scene. A few days later, he returned to the scene of the crime and involved the woman, Werner, and her daughter in a conversation about the crime. He later had the scissors used as a tool, the tips of which had broken off and got stuck in the head of the victim, sharpened. On this occasion, he also acquired a dagger. The mentally ill worker Johann Stausberg later confessed to the fact that the case was considered to be resolved. Only after Kürten was arrested could the fact be proven with the point of a scissor based on his confession and the circumstantial evidence. On February 9, 1929, he went from Flingern towards Gerresheim in the evening with a large pair of scissors. At around 6 p.m. on Behrensstraße, he met 9-year-old Rosa Ohlinger, who was lost. He offered to take the child home and then suggested the direction or to the address given by the child. At the height of the St. Vincent's Church, just a few steps away from Kürten's apartment, he stabbed the child several times with the scissors he had carried until it was dead. Due to a construction site, the crime scene was relatively hidden from view and was also not illuminated in the evening. Then he went to his apartment, cleaned tools and clothes, and left the apartment again to visit the Alhambra light shows, for which he had received a free ticket. After the screening, he returned to his apartment and filled a beer bottle with petroleum and looked up the child's body again. Since there were passers-by nearby, he could not set the corpse on fire, only put the beer bottle at the scene. In the early morning of the next day, he returned to the crime scene, where the body had gone undetected. He doused the body with the petroleum that was still there and set it on fire. He threw the bottle away. It was never found. Then he returned to his apartment. The body was only discovered early in the morning by construction workers. The insane Stausberg later admitted this murder as well. In the following years, Kürten visited the crime scene several times. In the years that followed, the construction site served him again and again as a hiding place for his murderous tools. After the murder of Rosa Ohlinger, Kürten roamed the area of the attempted murder of Apollonia Kühn every day. He wore the same clothes as on the previous day and carried the scissors with him. However, he initially found no victim in a suitable place. On February 12, 1929, he was about to return home when he came across the 54-year-old disabled Rudolf Scheer on Hellweg, near the Gerresheim allotment gardens around midnight. He came drunk from an inn and was on his way to his allotment garden. Kürten stabbed him with the scissors and, when the victim struggled, inflicted numerous more stings. He also tried unsuccessfully to take up the blood with his mouth. Then he pushed the seriously injured man down an embankment where he died during the night. The body was found the next day by the same woman, Werner, with whom Kürten has spoken only a few days earlier about the attempted murder of Mrs. Kühn. In March 1929, Kürten made the acquaintance of a single mother, whom he imagined living in divorce. After closer questioning, he admitted to having lied about his living conditions and assaulted the woman physically. In July 1929, Kürten was regularly out and about in the Zooviertel, where he spoke to women several times. Once, when he had already chosen the victim, he met his wife, who ironically addressed him about his companion. Kürten, who had his scissors with him, left both women standing and took off. Another time he persuaded a woman to visit the fair in Herd together. He choked her on the way back, but she escaped before he could pursue the scissors. On August 8, 1929, he met the domestic servant Maria Hahn at Hansaplatz and arranged to meet her on an excursion the following Sunday. On that Sunday, they met again at Hansaplatz and took the tram and train to Neanderthal, where they spent the day on a long hike and stopped at several restaurants on their way. On the way back to Gerresheim, Kürten lured his victim with a ruse to a secluded stretch of meadow, where he first choked Maria Hahn after initial tenderness and then stabbed Maria Hahn with the scissors he was carrying. This time he drank the victim's blood, but soon vomited it again. He put the body in a drainage ditch and went home. His dirty and bloody clothes aroused the suspicion of his wife, but Kürten had excuses. Nevertheless, he feared that he would be associated with the murder if it became known, so that he returned to the scene the evening after the crime and first made sure that the body was still in its place. He then went back to his apartment to get a shovel, which he used to go to the crime scene again that night and dig a grave nearby where he hid the body. His wife had noticed that he was out at night, but he was able to appease her again with excuses. And the following period, he returned frequently to the gravesite, initially to camouflage it even better, and later to satisfy himself in the vicinity. On August 20, 1929, after work, Kürten left to the fair in Lierenfeld. He carried the recently acquired dagger with him and spoke to several women about unsuccessfully that evening. At around 2 a.m., he followed two girls on their way home to Gumbertstraße, where one of the girls lived. After the girl had arrived at their apartment, he followed the other girl, 18-year-old Anna Goldhausen, a few meters and stabbed her with the dagger in the upper body. The girl was able to escape, however, called for help and rang the doorbell of her friend at house number 3, where they opened it quickly, so that Kürten hurried to escape. At around 2:15 a.m., he pressed a woman who was going home alone, 31-year-old Olga Mantel, who initially evaded him, but whom he pursued and who he stabbed several times in the back on Erkrater Straße. Alarmed by the woman's screams, a porter from the factory hurried up to who still pursued the perpetrator, but quickly lost sight of him. On his escape, Kürten attacked another man, 30-year-old Heinrich Kornblum, with a stab in the back near the fairground. Kornblum was able to escape and reached the fairground. Kürten hid the dagger near Erkrater Straße and hung around the fairground for a while to enjoy the excited atmosphere. Then he returned to Erkrater Straße and watched in the midst of a crowd of onlookers the removal of the seriously injured Frau Mantel. There he met the porter again, who thought he recognized him and asked him where he was from. Kürten was able to deceive him with an excuse, then took the dagger out of its hiding place and went home. The two seriously injured women were able to describe the perpetrator, but the description did not lead to the discovery of Kürten. The slightly injured Kornblum had been attacked from behind and had not seen the perpetrator. On August 24, 1929, Kürten again went in search of victims with the dagger. At first, he looked unsuccessfully for girls at the main train station. Then he took the tram to Flehe, where a shooting festival took place. He spoke to a woman in Wayne on Aachener Straße and then watched the fireworks at the shooting festival. He then followed 13-year-old Louise Lenzen and 5-year-old Gertrude Hamacher, who left the shooting festival on a dirt road. He spoke to the girls and asked the older one to get cigarettes for him. When she was out of sight, he choked the remaining 5-year-old into unconsciousness, carried her into a bean field and cut her throat there. Then he ran towards the returning other girl, whom he also choked and dragged into a leek field, where he also put the dagger at her throat. The girl struggled and first managed to escape, but Kürten soon caught up with her in the field and stabbed her with several dagger stabs. He left the children's bodies and went home. The bodies were found the next morning. On the morning after the crime, he drove to Oberkassel, where he spoke to the 26-year-old domestic worker Gertrude Schulte at the tram stop on Lugplatz, pretending to be the local post officer worker under a false name, and stole the women's trust. He persuaded them to visit the fair in Neuss, where they did not stay too long. On the way back with the tram to Oberkassel, he insisted on walking the last part of the way. The two got out at Hertha Rathaus, but instead of the shortest route, Kürten chose a route to the Rheinbogen near Lörrick. The local Schulte followed him in good faith to the Rhine meadows, where Kürten sexually harassed the woman. When she struggled, he stabbed her with the dagger. A particularly hard stab in the back broke the tip of the dagger and got stuck in the victim's vertebrae. The woman's cry for help had alarmed some young people nearby. As they approached, Kürten moved away from the crime scene and threw away the broken dagger. On Leostrasse, he searched the woman's handbag, kept a watch, and threw away the bag and the rest of its contents. At Lugplatz, he waited for the alarmed attack squad to drive past and then went home. The victim survived the crime seriously injured. On August 31st, 1929, Kürten spoke to the domestic worker Caroline Herstras at the main train station in the evening and managed to use a trick to get her to miss the last tram to Neuss. He offered to find her a room and led her to the bank of the Düssel near Ostpark, where he pounced on her. While the woman stated that Kürten had pushed her into the Düssel, interrogation by the police revealed that she had jumped on her own initiative and had also made the strangling marks on her neck herself. The case remained unsolved. On September 26, 1929, he attacked the domestic worker Maria Radusch in Gerresheim and strangled her, but the woman escaped. On September 29, 1929, Kürten went to Düsseldorf Central Station with a hammer. There he spoke to the 30-year-old unmarried domestic worker Ida Reuter. Together they ran over the Rhine Bridge to Oberkassel and from there to the Rhine Dam, near the point where Kürten had attacked Gertrude Schulte a month earlier. When dusk fell, Reuter insisted on turning around. Kürten agreed, but after a short stretch of the way back, he suddenly struck the woman with a hammer on the temple. He dragged the unconscious from the Rhine dam down into the less visible Rhine meadows, where he killed her with further hammer blows after dark. He took off the dead woman's pants and threw them, weighted down with pebbles, into the Rhine. He then took the same route back as after the attempted murder on Schulte. In the course of the morning, Kürten returned to the vicinity of the crime scene and watched the police officers working there. He threw the rest away. Then he returned to the corpse and began dragging it by feet to the Rhine in order to sink it into the river. When a man with a dog approached, he abandoned his plan and went home. The man, a police officer on patrol, had taken no notice. Reuter's body was found early in the next morning. On the evening of October 11th, 1929, Kürten went to downtown Düsseldorf with his hammer and looked for victims among the moviegoers between the movie theaters on Graf Adolf Straße. There he met the 22-year-old Elisabeth Derrière, keine Ahnung, who was looking for a job and a flat, with whom he first went into a brewery on Oststraße before she agreed to come to his apartment. Instead of going to his apartment, however, he took her to a meadow on the banks of the Düssel, where he hit her on the temple with a hammer. He dragged her behind a bush, where he attacked her and wounded her with further blows of the hammer. Assuming she was dead, he left the unconscious and threw away her coat, hat and bag on the way back. On October 25th, 1929, Kürten went to Flingern with his hammer in the early evening. There he spoke to a few little girls in vain before he met 34-year-old Hubertine Meurer in Hellwig. They started talking and walked down Hellwig together. There, they also talked about the Scheer murder case, which had happened nearby a few months earlier. When Meurer became suspicious, Kürten hit her on the temple with a hammer. He hit the woman lying on the ground and screaming for help on the head, but then let go of his victim, took his briefcase and left the scene. At Ostpark, he threw away the victim's bag, which only contained clothing. At Grafenberger Allee, he boarded the tram to Worringer Platz. After walking in the Hofgarten for some time, he walked back to town along the water. Halfway through, the prostitute Clara Wander spoke to him. Kürten was interested and both went back to the courtyard garden where Kürten attacked the prostitute at Pineapple Mountain with several hammer blows. On the last blow that left the victim unconscious, the hammer handle broke and the upper part with the hammer head flew into the bushes. Kürten left the victims and walked away in the direction of Hofgartenstraße. From there, he could see the victim, having come to, had started running loudly, calling for help, and was surrounded by several other women at the Ratinger Tor. He ran an arc over Jägerhofallee back to the Land Crown. On November 7th, 1929, Kürten picked up the Kaiserschere, picked up the scissors again when he was looking for a new victim in Flingern. At the Flingerner Kirche, he met 5-year-old Gertrud Albermann, who was playing in front of her aunt's house. He persuaded the child to go with him. Kürten also did not cause a stir when little Gertrud waved to a well-known family as they passed their house. 2 mechanics, to whom the man with the child appeared suspicious, speculated whether it might be the murderer he was looking for. But Gertrud's cheerful manner led them to believe that it was a father with his daughter after all. Kürten led the child through the allotment gardens to an allotment garden at the Haniel and Luke factory and choked her into unconsciousness there. Then he stabbed her temple with the scissors and tried to drink the blood that oozed out. He then assaulted the child and stabbed the child at random until it was dead. He deposited the body in a bush and went home. On December 7th, 1929, Kürten killed a swan at night in the courtyard garden by cutting its neck. Then he drank the animal's blood. On February 23rd, 1930, Kürten met a young domestic worker with whom he went to an inn and then to the Grafenberg forest, where sexual acts took place, during which he choked the woman. When asked about it by the woman, he described the gagging as a proof of love. A week later, Kürten met this woman again in his own apartment, but the two were surprised by Kürten's wife, who was returning home earlier. In March 1930, he lured the ironer Marianne del Santo under a pretext into the Grafenberg forest, where he began to choke her. The woman managed to escape. A few days later, after a similar incident, he pushed the domestic worker Irma Becker down the slope into the Wolfsschlucht into the Grafenberg forest. On April 13, 1930, he met the domestic worker Gertrud Hau, with whom he went to the courtyard garden at night after visiting a cafe, where he harassed her. There was a violent argument and the woman managed to escape. On April 30th, 1930, he went with the domestic servant Charlotte Ulrich to the Grafenberg forest, where he knocked her down with a hammer blow on the temple and further blows to the head. He initially thought that the woman was dead and left, but returned a few minutes later to the crime scene to make sure. However, the woman had regained consciousness and fled. On May 14th, 1930, Kürten was hanging around at Düsseldorf Central Station. He followed the young domestic servant Maria Butlis, who was on the way to the Volksgarten with an intrusive man. Kürten spoke to the couple and was able to get the man to leave Butlis. He then took the girl to his apartment, where he also became intrusive. After the woman protested, Kürten offered to take her to a girls' hostel into the Grafenberg forest. When he got to the forest, he choked the woman, but then left her and took her near a tram stop. Shortly thereafter, Maria Butlis described the incident in a letter to her friend Brückner in Düsseldorf. As luck would have it, the letter was mistakenly delivered to a Brückmann family on the same street that handed it over to the police. The investigation into the murders committed by Kürten remained unsuccessful for a long time. His well-groomed appearance and friendly manner did not make him look suspicious, especially when he returned to crime scenes in public, mingled with the onlookers, and occasionally even made contact with the investigating officers. At the same time, these characteristics had the effects that the victims did not become suspicious and that he could win the trust of new victims even after the first deeds became known. In retrospect, many circumstances of the investigation are puzzling. For example, the fact that Kürten, who is often known to the police, was not suspected when 9-year-old Rosa Ohlinger was murdered just a few steps from his apartment. The police's public relation work in the media was also still in its infancy, so neither the pieces of evidence found nor descriptions of the perpetrators of the surviving victims were communicated to the public. Whether the descriptions of the perpetrators would have ever led to Kürten remains questionable, as all witnesses estimated the perpetrator between 11 and 24 years younger than he actually was. Mrs. Kürten later stated that her husband put on makeup to look younger. However, none of the victims noticed any makeup. Around 12,000 reports of possible perpetrators were received from the population. There were also at least 3 references to Kürten. In the course of November 1929, for example, a former inmate, Kürten's, reported to the police and stated that he had bragged about similar deeds during the joint imprisonment. The police then had photos taken of Kürten in order to show them to the surviving victim, Schulte. Mrs. Schulte did not recognize the perpetrator in the photos. The police also asked some of Kürten's neighbors about his way of life, but they only knew him as the friendly, always well-dressed neighbor. The turning point in the investigation came with Maria Butley's wrongly delivered letter, in which she reported on her encounter with the perpetrator. The police searched with Butley's for the house where they had stayed with the perpetrator. After a long search, on the morning of May 21st, 1930, Butley's thought she recognized the house at Mettmanner Straße 71. After Butley's had been with police officer in the stairwell of the house, she was no longer sure whether it was the right house. At midday, she returned alone to the hallway of the house, where she reported the incidents to a neighbor. She saw Kürten too, but did not recognize him. The neighbor wrote Kürten's name on a piece of paper that Butley's handed over to the police that afternoon. She was now sure that she recognized the right house. On the following day, May 23rd, 1930, based on the information provided by Butley's, the police appeared in the morning at Mettmanner Straße, where no one was to be found. The officers then turned to Kürten's wife at her workplace at Café Hemesart and returned with her to the apartment. They informed her about the attack on Butley's and learned that Peter Kürten was unemployed and had moved out, but that he wanted to collect his support from the employment office the same day. The officers left a summons for Kürten and went to the employment office, where they waited for him the morning without success. In the meantime, Kürten had returned to Mettmanner Straße and he had received the summons from his wife. Confronted with the allegation of assaulting Butley's, he confessed to his wife the act. Yes, I did everything. Then Kürten left the apartment again. Around noon, he met his wife on what is popularly known as the Alley of Sighs, went to an inn for lunch with her, and then went with her to the Rhine Meadows, where he made a comprehensive confession of all deeds that lasted around 2 hours. He declined his shocked wife's suggestions, if necessary, together to commit suicide. Instead, he wanted to leave Düsseldorf and go into hiding. He arranged to meet his wife for a last meeting next afternoon at Rochus Church. In the meantime, Gertrud Schulte, who was attacked in August, had been presented with further photos of Kürten, on which she now recognized the perpetrator. Since Kürten was already in question for 2 acts, the police intensified the search for him and occupied the apartment at Mettmanner Straße, where they arrested Kürten's wife, who was returning from the Rhine Meadows. When she was interrogated, she first told the police about Kürten's hiding place at Adlerstraße, but he was not there. Taken into protective custody because of the risk of blackout, she reported, after she had mentally collapsed on the planned evening at the Rochuskirche. The following day, May 24th, 1930, Kürten was arrested at the planned meeting at Rochusmarkt. He made no resistance. 2 surviving victims, Gertrud Schulte and Maria Butley's, identified him in a comparison, whereupon Kürten made a comprehensive confession on the same day. In addition to the actions that can be clearly assigned to him, he accused himself of 3 further murders and 4 attempted murders in the Altenburg area, which later turned out to be false. Auguste Kürten was very tormented by the betrayal of her husband. For this reason, she was temporarily housed at the Grafenberg Mental Hospital. She took on a false name, filed for divorce, and moved to Leipzig after the trial of her former husband. The Düsseldorf jury court sentenced him to death 9 times on April 22nd, 1931, for murder in 9 cases and to 15 years of prison for the 7 attempted murders. an alleged killing of 2 boys on the banks of the River Rhine in Mülheim in 1893, to which Kürten had also confessed, was not taken into account in the judgment due to a lack of discovery and criminal responsibility. While Kürten visibly enjoyed the preliminary investigation at the trial, as there was a great deal of interest in his person and he was granted various perks and special requests during his pre-trial detention, he was visibly dissatisfied after the verdict was announced. He was a normal prisoner and no one paid any attention to him. The spectacular case and the verdict sparked a loud discussion in the press and public that soon went far beyond the Kürten case and dealt with general questions about the death penalty. In the afternoon on July 1st, he was informed of the rejection of the petition for clemency and the execution planned for the following morning. Kürten asked for spiritual assistance, whereupon the pastor of the institute was put at his side and his confessor from Düsseldorf also arrived in Cologne that evening. He spent the night sleepless in the company of the clergy and his lawyer and wrote letters to his wife, to surviving victims and his actions, and to their relatives. At 5 o'clock in the morning, he attended a mass read for him before he was told by the executioner at 6 o'clock he was executed by the guillotine. Despite all the secrecy, a group of reporters had gathered in front of the Klingelpütz prison before the execution. They were denied access to the execution, but a judicial spokesman informed them of the decision made. Kürten's execution met with an unanimously positive response in the press. Kürten's body was handed over to some of the doctors present for examination and for taking specimens. Among other things, the scientists also examined the brain for abnormal changes. The body was buried headless. The mummified head came after the Second World War into the United States and is now an exhibit at the museum, Ripley, believe it or not, in the Wisconsin Dells.